All right, sports fans, how's everybody out there doing? William Martin coming at you one more time here on YouTube with another edition of the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge Podcast. Now, it's been 2 years since Brett Yormark became the commissioner of the Big 12 Conference, and as the Big 12 could have been a sinking ship, Yormark continues to steady that ship for the years to come. Now, 13 years ago, and clearly this is long before Yormark took over things in the Big 12, the Big 12 was on life support as Nebraska left to join the Big 10, Colorado to the Pac 12, and then both Missouri and Texas A&M to the SEC. The Big 12 was on the verge of imploding, and they were very close, okay, within hours. But they found a way to hang on from collapsing, and they've stabilized and then some now. We saw the Big 12 be able to survive that near fiasco, and then they appeared to be on the fast track to another one until Yormark became the conference's commissioner, as he is hell bent on changing the game. Now, unfortunately, collegiate athletics are no longer a regional thing, as Yormark, like former Big Ten Conference Commissioner Kevin Warren, understand the importance of brands and media markets. You look at the Big Ten's expansion over the last 11 years, all right? It's resulted in them getting the New York media market due to the addition of Rutgers. And then, of course, the Los Angeles market, courtesy of USC and UCLA. Now, clearly, the Big 12 cannot go blow for blow with either the Big 10 or the SEC in regards to their brands. But Yormark is focusing on markets and regions. Now, upon taking over the Big 12, Yormark knew that he was losing Oklahoma and Texas to the SEC as he set his sights on the independent BYU, as well as a trio of schools from the American Athletic Conference in Cincinnati, Houston, and UCF. And when there was plenty of infighting in the Pac 12, okay, Yormark was more than eager to add some fuel to that fire by egging it on. And when it was all said and done, he was able to poach Utah, Arizona, Colorado, and Arizona State. So now you've got the Big 12 at 16 schools, and Connecticut could soon be in that mix as well. Yes, we all know UConn's football program is god awful. There's no other way to say it. But Yormark wants that New York area market. And I'm sure that Yormark would be happy to give Florida State and Clemson a place to hang their hats as well, as they are looking to leave the ACC. And the Big 12 would be the only viable option for the Noles and the Tigers if both the SEC and the Big 10 say no to them. So you look at the title of this, and I said the Vince McMahon of college football. It's one of those where, just like pro wrestling, college football is no longer a regional thing. And Yormark's drive, to me, honestly, is reminiscent of what we saw with Vince McMahon during the 1980s, when his drive to build the then WWF into a monster destroyed the wrestling territories, which had coexisted for so long. Now, McMahon wanted to be the king like Yormark does, but will Yormark's plan work? Yes, the Big 12 has schools, but they don't have the historic rivalries or the tradition that both the Big 10 or the SEC do, as both of those leagues, believe it or not, even through expansion, they're able to hold on to some of those historic rivalries. And at the same time, they're going to be able to give the college football world some new showdowns that basically you only really saw in bowl games or playoff games. And when I say showdowns, I'm talking about the blue bloods of the sport. Okay. Now, no disrespect to the Big 12, but this league as a whole has basically become a refuge, if you will, for all of those who are not perceived rather, to be good enough to get an invite to either the SEC or the Big Ten. That's basically what this thing has become. Now, don't get me wrong, a coast to coast conference sounds good on paper for football, but how many college football fans really want to go out there and see Cincinnati take on Arizona State or potentially Connecticut take on Utah? It's not something that is sizzling, so to speak, to the eye. Now, whereas the Big Ten, on the other hand, they could give you some heavyweight showdowns and that already, but even more now, because guess what? You got people that want to see USC take on Ohio State or Oregon and Michigan. You want people, you got people out there that want to see Texas take on Georgia, or Alabama take on Oklahoma and others. Don't get me wrong. The Big Ten and the SEC can give you some snoozers as well, but at the end of the day, they still are able to provide more of what college football fans want. Now, I talked about this the other night. The basketball attraction and lure of Connecticut, going to the Big 12, but UConn basketball ain't going to be the same, in the Big 12. We've seen that already, how that played out in the American. And I know that Dan Hurley is a phenomenal head coach. It ain't going to be the same. Okay. This is a Northeast guy coaching primarily in a Northeast league that's able to make it work. All right. The football money is there. We know that. But what about the other non-revenue college sports? And this is a thing that always, unfortunately, gets lost in the shuffle when we are talking about college football realignment. Because when you take football and men's and women's basketball out of the equation, the travel amenities are not the same for those kids in those other programs. And now you're asking kids, in multiple time zones, okay, to go out there and compete and still try to be students at the same time. We know about the power of the NILs, and it's a game changer, okay? And now college students are being treated more like professional athletes, and pro style contracts, are coming. So, with that said, what's the purpose of going to class for some of these kids? All right. But like I've said before, and I'll continue to pose the question, will college football realignment ever stop? It's one of those where I think at this point, it's not going to be stopped until most of the leagues are destroyed. Okay. It's one of those where everybody is going to see, well, they're getting more money than us. Why not us? And I keep saying this, this is what happens when you don't have revenue sharing. This is what happens when you don't have leadership. And this is what happens when you don't have a true commissioner. We've already seen the Southwest Conference fold, and this was close to 30 years ago now. All right. The Pac 12, basically, as we know it, no longer exists. While the Big East, they just threw in the towel on football and they're focusing on basketball. But, getting back to Brett Yormark and in his defense, he has positioned himself to survive the next round of elimination. Okay, because there's going to be another conference that will be eliminated. And at this point, it's all about survival. And if I were a betting man, I tell you, and I've said this before, and I'm going to stick with it, the next conference, the next power conference that's going to go is going to be the ACC. Now, college football realignment, unfortunately, has become the sports world's equivalent to either Survivor or The Amazing Race. That's all it is right now. And on Yormark's watch, the Big 12 could become the first league to get 20 members. I say this because I've talked about the SEC and the Big Ten before, but it looks like right now the Big Ten is content at 18. Why? Because they're adding 4 new members now, and they want to see uh, how Oregon, UCLA, USC, and Washington are all fit into the mix. And it's not just for football; it's for the other sports as well. And I think the SEC is somewhat content as well because for the most part, out of all of these leagues, the SEC still has somewhat of an extent of a regional feel. I know that they have expanded into the Southwest with A&M, with Texas and Oklahoma, but they still have somewhat of a regional feel. That's not the case in the Big Ten anymore. Darn sure ain't the case in the Big 12. And well, what can we say about the ACC as the Atlantic Coast Conference now has SMU, Cal, and Stanford? So you look at it, the Big 12 could be the first league to get to 20 because I think Yormark, is just hell bent on adding freight. And it's one of those where when you add more schools, clearly you have more mouths to feed. And adding the schools is one thing, but keeping all of those egos happy is another. So you're possibly talking about UConn. You're possibly talking about Clemson and Florida State. And what happens to Washington State and Oregon State if they're unable to rebuild the Pac-12 like they want to? Like I said before, and I'm going to keep saying it, this thing ain't going to stop. And for me, it's one of those where, you know what, make it make sense because I feel like, the Big 12 is in survival mode as far as adding schools, but they've got to add schools to me that kind of make sense, if you will. And getting back to the whole UConn thing, UConn football wise brings absolutely zero value to the table. Basketball wise, totally different. But like I said, they ain't going to be the same if they go to the Big 12. But nonetheless, Brett Yormark is hell bent on survival. You can't criticize him for that. He's seen how the game is played, and he says, you know what, game on, because I'm going to try to do it better than you all. But nonetheless, it's the name of the game, survival in the world of college football. So, folks, that is going to wrap it up. And as always, I want to take this time out to thank all of you for tuning into the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. I want to take this time out to thank all of you fine folks out there for tuning in. And if you haven't already, please feel free to subscribe to this channel. Now, if you're on the X, formerly known as Twitter, please feel free to follow me at 300 Pounds of Sports. And like I always say, if you follow me, it will be my pleasure to follow you right back. There's also the sports discussion group on Facebook at the Sports Depot 365. Now you can check it out. Drop a line and be a part of one of the better sports debating sites going on social media. So once again, fine folks, my name is William Martin, and I'm signing off. And I'm saying take care and have yourselves a wonderful day.